The following presentation is part of the Technology and the Corporation Conference Series, sponsored by MIT's Industrial Liaison Program.
Break coming up afterwards. So my work, as I'll tell you about, is as Daphne was just saying, on the bio-inspired side of material science, and its connection to advanced manufacturing and 3D printing, I think is still a bit out in the future. But as I'll show you today, biology, in particular the types of organisms that we've studied, definitely have found some pretty incredible ways of making materials underwater in a couple of minutes with very advanced functions. Can everybody hear me okay in the back? Is it loud enough? Yeah? I can turn it up a little bit. Is that better? Okay, thank you. Okay, so the rather long title, as usual, is not that important other than these types of chemistries, metal coordination, cross-linking. That's sort of the key theme of this talk. And the main take-home message I really want to get across with these types of cross-links is that we can use them to really control dynamics of polymer material networks, ultimately to control the mechanics of the materials. And for various properties, but especially for printing, these are important tricks. And so if you want to learn more about our work after today, you can also check out our website or just shoot me an email, okay? Okay, so just a little bit of background of where our inspiration comes from. It's from mussels, the ones that we eat from the ocean, so shellfish. As you all probably know, they live typically on the coastline, on most oceans around the world. They use these little holdfast fibers to anchor themselves to rocks or ships or all kinds of other substrates that they choose to live on. These holdfast fibers have been studied for a long time, ever since the ancient Greeks. They labeled them byssus, which actually means beard in Greek. So the mussel's beard was what they thought this was. And there's been a lot of interest in trying to understand how these materials actually function underwater. Most of the focus has been on these little tips of the fibers, which is called the plaque, which is where the adhesive is actually functioning at the interface with the rock typically. But as I'll show you, the actual mechanical properties of the fibers themselves are also very, very impressive. The mussel fiber, just for full disclosure, is then attached to the living tissue inside the mussel shell, and then to the rock on the other end. But the whole material, just so I remember to point that out from the beginning, it's a non-living material, okay? So this mussel fiber is basically a secreted protein macromolecular material. No living cells inside this material, okay? So the impressive thing is that they use these little fibers. They have similar dimensions to hair, about 100 microns in diameter, a couple of centimeters long. And they can use these fibers to hold on during really, really high wave forces. So if you take one of these fibers and you pull on it 3 times in a row, what's impressive about it is that the first time you pull on it, you see an initial very stiff mechanical response that then suddenly breaks over into this, what we call the yield point. And then you can keep pulling the fiber out into very long stretch without the fiber actually breaking. If you then let go, the fiber will slowly go back to its resting length, and the area inside this loop is what we call the dissipated energy. Okay? So the mussel fiber is a very good functioning shock absorbing material. It doesn't behave like a little piece of rubber, it behaves like an ideal designed shock absorbing material. It can dissipate a lot of energy during one of these stretches. What's interesting is if you pull on it a second time, it looks like that whatever gave it its original mechanical stiffness is now broken during this yield point, and it's much, much softer when you pull on it a second time. However, if you let the material rest underwater at room temperature for about an hour, it begins to get stiff again. So you see this slope begins getting high again, the yield point begins creeping back in, and if you wait long enough, the whole material will completely recover. So the mechanical properties are recoverable, and again, it's a non-living material. So something inside this material has been assembled in a way that allows it to dissipate and come back together automatically. Okay? And so people have used not only the word tough, it's a very tough material, but also self-healing. And that's one of these buzzwords in bio-inspired materials. There's a lot of interest in understanding how nature designs self-healing material properties. This is another example of that. So part of the secret that we think allows the mussel to assemble these self-healing fibers is the chemistry that it uses to make these materials. So without going into details, there's sort of 2 main components of a mussel fiber. There's a core component, which is mostly just collagen, similar to our own tendons. And then there's a little coating thin film laid down on top. And it's another type of protein. I won't go into detail. The most important thing is that both of these two materials, the coating material on top and the core material inside the fiber, are very rich in these types of metal coordinate crosslink chemistries. Okay? And it's well known from the literature, as I'll show you in a little bit, these metal coordinate types of crosslinks are very stable. So they're almost as stable as some type of covalent crosslink. So they give you high strength, but they're also very dynamic. Once you break them, they can reform very, very quickly. So they have interesting sort of microscopic chemical dynamics that might lead ultimately to some of these interesting bulk mechanics that we see in the whole fiber. Of course, there's many layers of assembly that I'm skipping over here, but at its core, this dynamic chemistry has a lot to do with these mechanical properties. Okay, so metal coordination bonds, not that I'll give you a big lecture on that, but it's well known from the biological literature and other systems. It's well known to play a role in catalysis of enzymes. It's well known to be important in the way that microbes actually absorb metals from the environment, both ocean and soil and inside our bodies. But this idea that nature actually uses metal coordinate chemistry for mechanical properties and load-bearing properties is new. But I think it's not just the muscle. There's probably many organisms that are actually using these types of crosslinks for mechanical properties of materials. Okay, so a little bit about the energetics of coordination bonds. Typically, they are reported to sit between what we would consider a covalent bond. So they're not as stable as a covalent bond, but they are much more stable than other types of non-covalent bonds. So much more stable than a hydrogen bond or hydrophobic interaction. So they sit in this intermediate energy regime. And if you're a physicist, typically they like to talk about something called KT. So it's, again, significantly more stable than a non-covalent bond, but not as stable as a covalent bond, okay? So this is where I think the sort of the biological connection to potential 3D printing or advanced manufacturing for the future comes in. So not that much is still understood about how muscles actually make these fibers, but this much is known. They basically use one of the fleshy parts. So the next time you eat a mussel, if you like to eat mussels, if you look at the flesh, there's a little part of the flesh right in the middle that looks like a fingertip or a tongue or a foot or whatever you think it looks like. Basically what the mussel does is it'll stick this little organ out into the ocean, so between the shell, out into the ocean, and it's that organ, it's that tissue that secretes a fiber. And it does so in a minute or two, underwater, repeatedly. It can make 80 fibers in, well, maybe not an hour, but a little over an hour. And so again, how the mussel does this is just beginning to be unraveled, so there's still a lot of mystery, but at least part of the tricks boil down to the most basics, is that the proteins that we just call metal coordinating proteins are somehow stored inside this tissue, separate from the metal ions. The metal ions are also stored in the tissue somehow in a secrete, in a sort of releasable form. And still not that much is known about the chemistry of that, but somehow these two components are stored separately inside this muscle foot tissue. And what the muscle then does is it basically the metal ions and the proteins together inside a groove in this tissue. So basically you see the tissue kind of fold up on itself, and then inside that groove, a muscle fiber self-assembles in a minute by just having these pre-components sort of squirted out and self-assembling into this functional fiber material, and also sticking to the rock, on this case it's a glass plate on the other end. So it's a pretty incredible advanced manufacturing underwater on a very, very short time scale. So part of the trick that we then realize the muscle is probably using is when these ingredients initially gets mixed, it takes place at a low pH. And that has now been documented to be true as well. So the initial secretion of the metal ions and the polymers, when they get mixed together, all takes place at a low pH. The reason that's important for the crosslink chemistry of these metal ions is that at low pH, some of these organic ligands that actually binds the metal ions will weakly interact with the metal ion. Not strong enough to make a very solid crosslink, but they can basically interact with the metal ion, but still move around and self-assemble and sit in the material hierarchy where they need to be. What the muscle then probably does take advantage of is once this initially fluid secretion gets exposed to seawater, so once this tissue actually pulls back and exposes this fluid filament to seawater, there's a big pH jump. So seawater is typically around pH 8, 8.1, depending on where you are in the ocean. And once that happens, once the pH jumps up, these organic ligands that bind the metal ions become much more strongly binding to the metal ions. So they deprotonate. So if you can see it, they have these what we call hydroxyl groups in this case. That'll become protonated, so you'll have an O minus that then really wants to donate its electrons to this d orbitals. Long story short, the pH switch really drives the formation of the crosslink and solidifies the material really, really quickly. So to mimic that in a much, much simpler system, we've been playing with polymers that are soluble underwater. These are called polyethylene glycol polymers that are very used in medicine and medical materials. They've been functionalized as a 4-arm polymer. It's been functionalized with 4 of these metal binding ligands. All we do is we take some of that polymer, dissolve it in a little bit of water, take our choice of metal salt. We started with iron chloride. That seems to be what the muscle prefers, and they have high binding affinity. Mix those 2 fluid droplets together. And again, what you get when you mix these 2 together is initially a low pH solution because the iron ions will actually drop the pH of this solution. Again, low pH gives you weak binding between your organic ligand and your metal ion. And because metal quantum chemistry has been so well studied in the literature, it's very well known that you can just look at the color changes of the interaction between the ligands and the metal ions. And from that color change, you can understand what type of interaction you have. So when these 2 fluids mix, you get a green fluid, and that green color has been known to come directly from the absorption of this complex. All we do is just change the pH. We can easily do that just adding a little bit of sodium hydroxide. That should then activate this bond formation. That should also change the color of this complex. It should absorb at a different wavelength. And what happens, this is a picture of a droplet of sodium hydroxide flowing into this polymer ion mixture. And immediately where those 2 fluid boundaries meet, you get instant gelation. So it's a very, very fast kinetic process. And all we then do is just basically mix this around physically, and you get this silly putty-like viscoelastic hydrogel. So this is a hydrogel with not a very high polymer weight percent and not a lot of metal ion. And it's a very tough hydrogel you've already made, purely because it's held together with these dynamic bonds. So it's a very simple crosslink chemistry to rapidly go across a fluid-solid transition with a simple chemical. That's definitely what the muscle is taking advantage of. Okay, so the 2 stories I'll tell you really quickly on what we've then been sort of using these types of insights to demonstrate is various types of hydrogel networks. We're all using this 4-arm polyethylene glycol polymer. We're not even switching the polymer on any of this stuff. And basically we're now just playing with different types of metal ions. And then we've also begun doing work where we add metal nanoparticles as the cross-linking structure. And I'll show you we get dramatically different properties in the materials as a function of whether we use a metal ion or a particle. Okay, so again, what we do a lot with these viscoelastic gels is we'll try to study their soft mechanical properties. What you do is basically you will study the time scale over which they flow. So this is just a qualitative image series of a gel that's basically just with gravity flowing down and pulling itself out into these long fibers. If you use the same polymer, and instead of cross-linking it with metal ions, but you actually just give a covalent crosslink in the network, you also get a gel, but you get a little piece of rubber. Okay, so it's a hydrogel, but it doesn't flow like this one. It's not viscoelastic like silly putty. It just behaves like a little piece of rubber. The types of techniques we use mechanically to really try to understand the mechanical properties of these viscoelastic called rheology. And without going into too much detail, what you can do with these types of rheological measurements is you can take your material, put it in a rheometer, and what we do is we'll oscillate the gel at a range of frequencies. And if you do low frequencies, that means you're basically deforming the material very slowly. If you do high frequencies, you're deforming the material very fast. If it's a little piece of rubber, the material doesn't really care how fast or slow you deform it. It behaves the same way. So you get 2 types of elastic measurements out of it. You get something and the loss modulus, which is d double prime. This is sort of the elastic, direct elastic response of the network, and this is the fluid-like response. For a permanently cross-linked network, the elastic behavior is much higher than the fluid-like behavior. That's a very classical type of behavior. For these types of metal coordinate cross-links, however, you see this crossover between what would be considered the elastic response and the fluid-like response. That crossover is basically the fluid-solid transition in time. So if you push it slowly, just like silly putty, it'll flow. If you push it fast, it'll behave like a little piece of rubber. And that time scale in our material, and that's really the unique part about these materials compared to other polymer materials, is that we don't have any entanglements in these types of materials. You can get viscoelastic properties in something like silly putty because you have really long polymers that wrap around each other. We have really short polymers, but the reason they still behave like silly putty is because of the dynamics of this crosslink. time scale, the amount of time you spent in the cross-link state versus the uncross-link state dictates these viscoelastic properties. That's how we can control this fluid-solid. So, very briefly, what you can now easily do is keep the polymer exactly the same. Of course, you can do a bunch of fancy polymer engineering, but before you even do that, you can keep the polymer exactly the same and just play with a bunch of different metal ions, a bunch of different pH values, and you can make a whole series of gels. From very fluid-like gels to very solid-like gels, just with a switch of a single metal ion. It's all about where you are in the stability regime of the cross. So one of the first things we did was then play this simple trick where we don't just add one metal ion to the network, but we actually add two different metal ions to the network. If you pick two different metal ions that give you two different stabilities of crosslinks, you get both a fluid-like dissipative mechanism and a much slower, more solid-like dissipative mechanism. It's something that's really hard to engineer with classical polymer engineering because you typically use molecular weight and you don't get good mixing and so forth. This is super easy in these networks because you just mix in two small metal ions that give you two different time scales in your network. And so we have a fast time scale and a slow time scale in the network. Again, we use this 4-arm polymer. We use a slightly different ligand than the one I showed you before. This type of ligand is called a histidine. To bind to divalent transition metal ions, but we have a lot of choice in terms of what ligands and metal ions we use. Again, from the literature, we knew that the nickel metal ion should give you long-lived crosslinks on the order of tens of seconds. The cobalt ion should give you something that's much shorter lived and much more fluid-like. What you see with the nickel network, pure nickel network, is again a slow, almost elastic-like material. For the cobalt network, it's a much more fluid-like material. The crossover is at a much higher frequency. But when you then do a 50-50 network, what you see is you see two of these energy dissipative peaks, which again shows you that you have energy dissipation built into the network purely from the type of crosslinks you have in there. You also see that the elastic response, at a certain time scale, the network gets stiffer. So it's sort of a built-in stiffening mechanism that if you deform the material fast enough, the network that operates on these timescales actually kicks in and the material gets thicker. So the faster you pull, the stiffer the material becomes. And you can engineer that very controllably with these types of metal ions. Okay, so another thing we've been doing, again, just demonstration of how we can play tricks with these types of chemistries, is, well, down here at the bottom of the periodic table, we have some very exotic rare earth metals called lanthanides. But there's been a lot of work in many different types of materials showing that if you use lanthanides as your cross-linking species in these types of metal coordinate crosslinks, you actually get fluorescence. So if you excite these types of crosslinks with typically UV light, you get fluorescence as a function of what lanthanide ion you use. You can tune the color that the material will emit. So what we did is, again, work with this same type of polymer. We switched up the ligand a little bit again to something that we know binds lanthanide ions very strongly. And we showed that if you just have the polymer mixed into solvent without any lanthanide ions, the polymer by itself will emit blue light when you excite it. If you now cross-link it with europium ions, you get a red emitting gel. If you cross-link it with terbium ions, you get this green-blue emitting gel. And if you now mix the red and the blue ions in the right ratio, you get a white light emitting gel. That might not be surprising or particularly exciting, but the reason that we are actually excited about it is not that these have very good quantum efficiencies or anything, so we're not proposing to use these for any sort of lighting applications or anything like that. But what's cool about it is you now have a material that emits white light when you excite it with UV, and as a function of what you do to these materials in terms of throwing different types of stimulus at it, it'll change color. And the reason for that is you have this balance of red emitting bonds and green-blue emitting bonds. If those bonds respond slightly different to temperature or mechanical stress or pH, these two ratios will shift and you get a color change. A lot of other stimuli-responsive light-emitting material will actually just decrease their intensity or increase their intensity as a response, but these ones change its color. And it's a very, very simple way of playing this trick. Just to show we can easily engineer the color with the metal ions. We can paint with these types of gels and let them dry out. They'll respond in this thin film format to different types of acid or base treatment. They're very sensitive to temperature, so they're very good sort of soft material thermometers. And even in the dry state, they will still keep their responsive properties. What we're really, really excited about and what we're working very hard on now, we can also use this as a mechanochromic material, so material that actually senses strain and stress. So this is just a qualitative demonstration. We have one of these white light emitting gels. We sonicate it in a sonication bath. the gel network will break up, it'll turn into a fluid, it'll turn into a blue emitting fluid, and again, the free polymer, once it actually is unbound to the metal ions, is this blue emitting polymer. So again, we've ripped the metal ions out of the network, we have a blue emitting fluid, we let it rest overnight, and it self-assembles back into a white light emitting gel. So it's self-healing, but it also changes color as a function of when you break the material. So right now we're working with ExxonMobil on trying to actually use these for thin film coatings of strain and temperature and stress sensing materials. So we'll see if we can actually get it to work. But so far it looks pretty promising. And this is just some data that shows that we can actually monitor the changes in the amount of bonds that's breaking out in this region where we have the blue light emission. Okay, so another quick little thing we've recently done is also show that we can, and again, for it's relevant for potential 3D printing, I think this is interesting. We can actually add a light-activated molecule to this type of network. So this is something that's commonly done in other types of materials. This is just a little photosensitive molecule. When you shine light on it, it'll dissociate and it'll generate a free radical. If we do that in the presence of different types of metal coordinate complexes, we can actually tune the fluid-solid transition even more dramatically. So this is just a quick little demonstration showing that, where we now report, again, the elastic modulus of these networks. If you use a nickel ion as your cross-linking species, nothing really changes when you turn the UV lamp on. If you use a cobalt cross-linking ion, the material actually gets 2 orders of magnitude softer, so it gets much more fluid-like. If you, however, use cobalt as your cross-linking metal ion, it gets almost 4 orders of magnitude stiffer. So again, just with a little bit of UV light, and this is not a very powerful lamp, you can change it from this viscoelastic, silly putty-like material to a very, very stiff gel, just with the flick of a light. And we're no experts in 3D printing, I'll admit that, but the people I've spoken with, this should not be too difficult to rig up across a print head. Just a little UV lamp, and you can tune this fluid solid transition very, very dramatically. Okay, so the last 15 minutes, I'll tell you a little bit about what we've then been doing with the nanoparticle cross-linking gels. So this is definitely a very different type of cross-link. It's relatively much, much bigger than a metal ion. So you're going to get many more ligands binding each particle than you would have binding a metal ion. And that's going to dictate the mechanics into a much more solid ion machine. So the way we've begun thinking about how we're actually engineering this space is we're trying to really control energy dissipation or fluid solid-like properties, is another way of saying it, as a function of sort of the chemistry of the crosslinks, so the kinetics, the sort of lifetime of the individual crosslinks. And this was all work that's done by Scott, all the work I just showed you. Or, as I'll show you now, we're now trying to engineer the actual structure of the crosslink, so both playing with metal ions and these nanoparticles. And the work I'll show you now is done by my other student, Chao Chu Liu. They're both, Scott just graduated and Chao Chu is about to graduate. Okay, so again, this is the basic idea, metal ion as a cross-linking species in the network or nanoparticle. And this is just a little video that shows 2 different gels at room temperature. This gel is held together with metal ions, this is held together with nanoparticles. And what you'll see is that at room temperature, it's sped up a little bit. This one will basically curl into a little drop just due to surface tension, whereas this one will hold its own shape because it's now cross-linked with these nanoparticles. And so the thing we're trying to understand and learn to control is as a function of how many of these organic ligands we have bound per cross-linking species. In this case, it's only 3 for an iron. And for the nanoparticles, as a function of the size of the particles, you can get up to hundreds of ligands stuck per particle. So just by controlling the number of ligands bound per crosslink structure, you can really engineer how fluid or solid like you want your material to be. So this is, again, just a way of showing sort of the 3 different materials we can easily play with to demonstrate this. This is a permanent covalent crosslink network, again, I showed you earlier. This is the metal ion, this is the nanoparticle. And if on the mechanical tester, the rheometer, instead of doing these frequency sweeps, you actually just apply a small strain and then watch the stress in the material relax over time. It's called a stress relaxation test. You can really see the 3 different materials behave dramatically different. So the permanently cross-linked material, the covalent network, will not relax. It'll keep its stress up high for hours. It should not relax at all unless you break it. The metal ion network will relax on the order of tens of seconds, whereas the nanoparticle network does relax, but it does so much, much, much slower. And it does so in a controllable fashion. How quick or slow we make this nanoparticle network relax has to do with the number of stickers bound per crosslink. Okay? So this is something we're trying to understand. The relaxation time is something that we call tau, and we're trying to understand how that relaxation time tau can be controlled with this functionality, this number of stickers per crosslink. So a very easy trick to play is we can obviously just make smaller nanoparticles. We should have fewer ligands stuck per particle. It should be more fluid-like. That's exactly what happens. Is again a stress relaxation curve. The smaller the particle, the more fluid-like the network. It relaxes faster. This is the bar plot showing the same thing. An even simpler trick, instead of changing your particles, you can actually just begin to add free ligands to the network, where you now begin to bind the particle with ligands that will not contribute to the elasticity of the material. You're basically just crowding out the stress-bearing crosslinks per particle and forcing them off the particle and then making the network more and more fluid-like. And that actually works even simpler. So again, without engineering the material composition of your network, you just add more and more of these small molecules and you can engineer it down into a fluid or back up into a solid very, very easily. Okay, so the last thing I'll show you is a little bit more going into the depths of not just controlling sort of the average relaxation time of the network, but something, I won't go into too much of the math, but something that has to do with how wide of a distribution of relaxation times do you actually have in your material. So let me just explain what I mean with that. So we have different ways of crosslinking these networks now. We can either use metal ions or nanoparticles. And in addition to these networks being much more solid-like compared to these networks, one thing you also get in these much more solid-like materials is a much broader distribution of relaxation. The reason we care about that is broader distribution of mechanical relaxation is really the underlying mechanism for toughness. So if you want to engineer something such as toughness, you want to have many timescales of dissipation in your network. Whereas this type of material where you only have one type of timescale in your material, it's not going to be a very tough material. And so what this type of math can allow you to measure is this parameter up here that we call alpha. The value of that alpha is, if alpha is close to 1, it means you have a very narrow distribution and it won't be a very tough material. If alpha is very close to 0, you have a much broader distribution and you're going to get a much tougher material. So if again we compare these two different types of networks, I'll just skip through some of the basics. Again, what I told you, the relaxation time tau for the nanoparticle gel as a function of the ion gel, it's much higher tau values than the metal ion gel. If we heat these networks, it's still much more solid-like for the nanoparticle gel than the metal ion gel. If we now look at this alpha value, as we expected, the metal ion gel has a high alpha value, meaning a narrow distribution, meaning not a very tough material. The nanoparticle gel, on the other hand, is a much tougher material, broader distribution. And again, it comes from the fact that we now use these nanoparticle crosslink structures. We can play with the size distribution of nanoparticles. We can play with how efficiently the polymers actually bind the particles. And then just because you have many particles bound per particle, for this whole structure to relax stress, you need all these polymer ligands to actually pop off the particle. And that basically spreads out the energy dissipation over time. And that's ultimately a good way to engineer toughness. A very simple way by using these dynamic crosslinks to engineer toughness. Okay, so that again is sort of the space we're operating in, controlling the kinetics as well as controlling the crosslink structure. So the last little thing I'll show you, and then I'll let you ask some questions if you have any, is this idea of, well, what now happens if instead of just using either metal ions or nanoparticles, if we now make a material that have both types of crosslink structures in it? So that, similar to what we did with just two different types of metal ions, same idea, but because these nanoparticle structures are so much more stable and gives you so much more solid-like properties, you could see dramatically different behaviors as a function of how many nanoparticles and metal ions we have in the material. We've begun making these hybrid networks where we both have metal ions. This is meant to indicate a metal ion crosslink structure, and nanoparticles in the same network. Again, the metal ion crosslink structure are short-lived, so fluid-like. The nanoparticle crosslink structures are long-lived and much more solid-like. So this should give us load-bearing properties. This should give us these types of dynamic self-healing properties built into the same material. So this is, again, stress relaxation plots. This NP0, and this is recent data, so it's not as pretty as the others, but this NP0 has no nanoparticles, only metal ions. It relaxes on the order of tenths of seconds. And then the more nanoparticles we load into the material, what happens is that this slow relaxation on long time scales begin to become more and more dominant. This is just to show the more particles you have, the more solid-like the material becomes. What's interesting is we've begun to pull on these materials now, not just do this very well-controlled rheology, but now we actually take these gels and we pull them apart, and we try to measure how strong they are and how much energy they dissipate. So this is, again, a pure metal ion cross-linked material, this red one. It behaves, again, like a very viscoelastic, silly putty-like material. If you pull it fast, it can carry some stress, but if you pull it slow, it won't really carry that much stress. As you add more and more nanoparticles, the gels become more and more solid-like and ultimately almost brittle. They will actually snap if you pull them fast enough. So this is just a little video showing a hybrid material where we have a certain weight percent of iron oxide nanoparticles and then also some metal ions in there. And this is just to show qualitatively how these materials. This is real time, so we pull on it the first time. The material will break somewhere right there, and you can see it does break like a solid-like material. Xiaochu will then just qualitatively put it back together, let these two surfaces reheal for a couple of minutes, and he doesn't do a perfect, that's just a qualitative demonstration. And we pull it again, and it'll actually go up to almost 100% strain within just a couple of minutes of recovery. So the exciting thing is you can do these types of self-healing tests where you pull the material to fracture, you put it back together, you let it rest a certain amount of time, and then you pull on it again to see how much it actually recovered. And so our early data shows that for these types of hybrid materials, as a function of how long you let the material recover once you put it back together, at room temperature, we're not heating them, we're not applying pressure, we're just letting them touch each other. Within 5 minutes, the initial mechanical properties has recovered completely. Okay, and that's again going back to what we were excited about the muscle material in the beginning. Now, what's even more interesting is so it's quick self-healing at room temperature. That's already exciting. But what's even more interesting, if you now actually begin to play with the relative ratio of metal nanoparticles and metal ions, and if we actually now keep the nanoparticle loading in the material the same, this gives us very solid-like properties, 3.5 weight per particles. But we change the amount of these short-lived bonds we have in there. What you see, this is a way of actually measuring the healing efficiency, so how good the material is as recovering as a function of how long you give it a time to recover. If you don't have a lot of metal ions in there, it never recovers. But the more metal ions you add, the quicker it becomes at recovering. So we can sort of engineer the load bearing as well as the self-healing, which is something that's otherwise really difficult to do with classical material design approaches. So this is sort of the story we're trying to put out now. When people talk about engineering materials, similar to whether you're trying to engineer a tough material, there's oftentimes trade-offs to be made. There's compromises to be made, as you all probably know, between different types of material properties. Okay? So when you try to engineer something that's self-healing, what people oftentimes need to compromise is the stiffness of the material or the elastic modulus. What Xiaochu did is he sat down and went through the literature and looked at all the different types of materials that have been reported so far with different types of approaches, nanocomposites, chemical gels, physical, all types of material design approaches. Reported the elastic modulus, how stiff they are, and how quickly they self-heal. And so you can see there's some sort of trade-off. If you have very stiff materials, they don't heal that fast. Or if you have fast healers, they're typically not that strong. So, and that's built in if you only try to use one type of cross-link your material. So the real challenge is, can we actually begin to go in this direction? Keep the stiffness of the material high and still speed up the recovery, okay? And that's exactly what this class of material is beginning to do. That by having a certain amount of nanoparticles, we keep the strength up, but the more metal ions we add in there, the quicker they become at self-healing. So we're trying to understand the underlying physics of this right now, but at least so far the data seems to suggest that this is a step in the right direction of engineering both strong and self-healing materials. Okay, so the last little bit I just wanted to get back to, as I mentioned in the beginning, I don't think it's just the muscles that are using these metal coordinate chemistries. Now people are finding them in snail slimes, in types of organisms that are good at actually, if you poke a hole in this outer soft tissue of this, it's called marine fragmentopod is what they call it, the marine biologist. But if you poke a hole in the skin, it actually can reheal that underwater at high pressure in a couple of minutes. And this is also the sealant that these types of organisms use, very rich in this metal coordinate chemistry as well. These are called sandcastle tube building worms. They can actually, as a little mason, underwater mason, encapsulate their soft bodies, in a tube of sand grains that they'll basically glue together with a soft, sticky glue. This glue has now also been found to be very rich in metal coordinate bonds. And again, mussels, as I told you about, they have these self-healing fibers. But it's not just these very soft to semi-soft materials. It's all the way up to very dense, very, very stiff, and very hard materials too. So this is called a polychaete, a marine worm. And these black things out here are its teeth. It's actually a poisonous worm. So it'll use these teeth to capture prey and then pull it back into wherever it's lived. These teeth, as far as the marine biologists, the marine biochemists have looked at these, have no solid inorganic in them. So they weigh a fraction of our teeth, for example. They're just as stiff and just as hard. But what they are full of is metal coordinate bonds. So I think, not yet, we don't know how these teeth are made yet, but it's not just in these soft, silly, polyviscoelastic materials that this type of chemistry is useful. I think it's also in the assembly and production eventually of very lightweight, hard condensed materials that this metal coordinate chemistry is going to be useful. So we've begun playing a little bit with this. If we actually just dehydrate some of the gels, just get rid of the solvent, what we're left with is something that is, not surprisingly, it's stiffer because we got rid of the solvent, but it is much, much stiffer than what we would expect, and it's still energy dissipated. So we've begun playing with what happens to these types of processing structures once you get rid of the solvent. And I think, again, this is something biology plays with a lot in sort of materials manufacturing. It makes things in a wet, hydrated state, and then oftentimes there's a dehydration gradient going on that makes the material stiffer, but still keeps some of the material properties built in there. Okay, so, this is just a shout out. We didn't publish this work, but now some people at UCSB have just begun using these mussel-inspired, again, iron catechol or coordinate complexes in an elastomer. So again, no solvent in this material. And they report completely, orders of magnitude more tough and stiff elastomeric properties than what you have otherwise seen with traditional chemistry. It definitely seems to be a useful cross-link chemistry. All right, so our collaborators for a lot of this work is Gareth McKinley in McGee. Joe Tracy is down at NC State. He makes our nanoparticles. These are some of the papers that I referred to. And Chao Chu and Scott. Scott graduated. Chao Chu is still here a little while longer. They're the ones who did most of the work. And I'll be happy to take any questions. Thank you.